39,000 feet above the American heartland. A Boeing 787 cuts through winter air, steady and indifferent, carrying 240 passengers toward New York. From the outside, it looks like every other flight, routine, unremarkable. The kind of thing that happens 10,000 times a day across this country and leaves no trace. But inside the first-class cabin, something is wrong. Not loud, not obvious, just a single empty champagne flute, one man, one seat, passed over so smoothly that most people wouldn't notice. He notices. He always notices. A silver tray moves down the aisle. Every seat, every glass, every passenger, except one. The man in 2A doesn't flinch, doesn't speak, just opens an old laptop with a scratched hinge and starts typing. What no one on this plane knows yet will change everything before this flight lands. She walked right past him. No pause, no eye contact. Not even the small professional nod that flight attendants gave to acknowledge a passenger existed in their row. Beverly Marsh moved down the first-class aisle with a silver tray of champagne flutes, and she served every seat in that cabin. Every seat except one, seat 2A. The man sitting there watched her go. He didn't say anything, didn't raise his hand, didn't clear his throat or shift in his seat, or do any of the things that a person does when they want to be noticed. He opened his laptop, started typing. His name was Darnell Price. He was 43 years old, he was wearing a dark hoodie, jeans, and sneakers that had enough miles on them to show it. His backpack was under the seat in front of him. His laptop was old enough to have a scratched hinge. He looked to anyone who glanced at him like a man who did not belong in first class, which was exactly what Beverly Marsh had decided the moment he walked through the cabin door. What Beverly did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that the document open on that flickering laptop screen was titled Creston Airways, Day Zero Assessment. And the man typing into it had signed the papers to purchase this airline 72 hours ago for $3.4 billion. He typed one line. Champagne service, bypassed. No acknowledgement, no explanation offered. 10:41 a.m. Then he looked out the window at the country below and waited to see what would happen next. Darnell Price did not celebrate. That was the first thing his assistant Raymond noticed. 23 minutes after the ink dried on the most consequential acquisition in Pinnacle Group's 14-year history, Darnell was alone in the conference room. No champagne, no calls, team-signed documents, held up like a trophy, just a man, a yellow legal pad, a pen moving across the page. Raymond lingered in the doorway, holding a bottle the board had sent up. He waited long enough to understand this was not going to be the kind of night he'd expected. Then he quietly set the bottle on the Kreza and left without a word. Darnell didn't look up. He was writing a list. Not a celebration list, not a press release or a memo to department heads. It was a list of questions, the kind that never appeared in board reports, the kind that consultants flew past because consultants always arrived announced. What does the coffee taste like in economy? Do flight attendants smile the same way at every passenger or only at the ones in the expensive seats? When something goes wrong at altitude, who gets helped first? He had learned this habit from his father, not from a business school case study, not from the Harvard curriculum that now referenced his acquisition strategies as teaching examples. From a man named Robert Price, who spent 31 years on the Ford assembly line in Detroit and came home every night with grease under his fingernails and something unbroken behind his eyes. Robert Price had a saying, "You want to know what a place is really made of? Don't walk in looking like somebody. Walk in looking like nobody. See how they treat nobody. That tells you everything." Darnell had applied it to every company he'd ever bought. Hotels, a retail chain, a regional hospital network. He'd worked anonymous shifts, stood in lines, called customer service numbers from phones that couldn't be traced back to him. Every time, he found things that never showed up in the financials, things that consultants missed because they were never invisible enough to see them. Creston Airways was different in scale. 70 years old, routes across 38 states, 14,000 employees, a customer satisfaction problem that the outgoing CEO had described in the acquisition documents as a culture gap. Darnell had read that phrase twice. He thought he knew what it meant. He booked the ticket himself, used his own name because the Creston reservation system wasn't yet integrated with Pinnacle's ownership structure. Paid full price. First class Los Angeles to New York, Flight 112. Departing 7:45 in the morning, he packed light. The canvas backpack he'd owned for 9 years, the old laptop with the scratched hinge, a fitness tracker, a paperback he'd been meaning to finish for 3 months. He dressed the way he dressed on weekends. He did not bring a suit. He did not bring anything that would signal to anyone what he was worth or who he was. That was the point. The memory came the way it always came, not during the hard moments, not when he was under pressure or running late or navigating a room full of people who'd underestimated him. It came in the still moments, the ones where everything had slowed down enough for the past to catch up. He was 16 years old. His father had just finished a double shift, November, cold enough that breath made small clouds in the parking lot air. Robert Price was still in his work clothes when he stopped at the grocery store on Mack Avenue because they were out of milk and Darnell's younger sister needed it for her cereal in the morning. A 2-minute errand. It took 40 minutes because the moment Robert walked through those automatic doors, a security guard appeared from somewhere near the pharmacy and began following him. Not with any pretense of routine patrol, just following, aisle to aisle, past the cereal, past the dairy case, all the way to the register. Robert paid for the milk, counted out exact change, thanked the cashier by name because he'd shopped there for 11 years and he knew her name. Then he walked out. In the car, he didn't say anything for a while, started the engine, let the heat run. And then he turned to Darnell in the passenger seat and said the thing that Darnell would spend the next 27 years turning over in his mind like a stew he couldn't set down. You go further than they think you can go. That's how you answer them, not with your mouth, with where you end up. Sitting in seat 2A at 39,000 feet, Darnell thought about that sentence. He'd gone pretty far. He wasn't done yet. Los Angeles International at 6 in the morning had its own texture. Not chaos, exactly. Not calm, the shuffle of luggage on tile. The hiss of automatic doors, the smell of chain coffee and recycled air, and the low-grade anxiety of people trying to get somewhere on time. Darnell moved through it the way he always moved through public spaces, without announcement. Without the into rooms as a way of declaring their presence. He stood in the regular first-class line. The check-in agent processed his boarding pass with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before breakfast and would do it 1,000 times after. She did not recognize his name. He didn't expect her to. The acquisition had been announced to the board and no one else. The public statement was scheduled for 9 o'clock the following morning. For the next 26 hours, Darnell Price was just a man in a dark hoodie boarding a flight that he now owned. He found a seat near the gate window and opened the laptop. The screen flickered once in the lower corner, then held. He opened a new document and typed 4 words at the top. Creston, Z0 begin. Then he's watched the gate fill up and waited for the boarding call. The passengers who filtered through told him things before anyone had spoken a word. A man in a chivy suit checking his watch like time was a resource he's managed personally. A woman with a legal pad already open before she'd sat down. A younger woman with 2 phones and the focused awareness of someone whose job was to see things other people missed. He noted them all. He was building a picture. By the time the gate agent called first class, he'd already written 3 observations that had nothing to do with the meal service or the seat configuration or the in-flight entertainment system. They had to do with how people occupied space, how they held themselves when they thought no one was watching, how they treated the gate agent when she asked to see their boarding pass. Small things. The kind that added up to everything. Beverly Marsh had worked the first-class cabin on this route for 11 of her 30 years with Creston Airways when she was 56. Silver hair pinned with precision, a way of moving through the aisle that used exactly as much space as necessary and no more. In every visible, measurable sense, she was outstanding at her job. She knew the wine list. She knew the meal options. She knew which repeat passengers wanted their water still, and which wanted sparkling, and which would ask for something specific that wasn't on the menu and needed to be told gently that it wasn't available without being made to feel the lack of it. She was warm, professional, attentive to most people. The passengers boarded in the order they always boarded. Walt Stover came through first, 57 years old. Real estate developer out of Phoenix. A suit that had been made for his particular frame by someone who charged accordingly. A watch that announced its own cost without being obvious about it. Walt settled into seat 3C with the ease of a man who had been in rooms like this his whole life and had stopped registering the effort it used to take to get into them. Beverly was at his side within 30 seconds. "Good morning, Mr. Stover. Can I start you with something?" Walt smiled. "The Cabernet. And make sure the steak isn't overcooked this time." Of course. She said it like it was a pleasure. Like Walt's preference for medium rare was a small gift he was offering her. Dr. Gerald Odom boarded next, 64, broad-shouldered in the way that men who were once athletes carry it with them into their later decades. He was a cardiothoracic surgeon at Cedars-Sinai, traveling to New York for a conference where he was delivering the keynote. He moved with the calm of a person accustomed to making decisions that other lives depended on. Beverly greeted him correctly, professionally warm. Brought his water before he asked because she'd seen his profile in the system and knew he always asked for water first. Ann Colby came in behind him, 52, dark blazer, reading glasses already on, a legal pad tucked under her arm with handwriting so small it looked like it required magnification. Civil litigator. 4 Supreme Court arguments. The focused quiet of a person whose brain was always working on something 3 steps ahead of the room. Beverly brought her champagne without being asked. Anne accepted it without looking up. Then Deb Farrow, 31. Jeans and a good jacket. Natural hair. A phone in each hand and a small camera bag over one shoulder. She wrote long-form investigative pieces for several publications and had built a following of 800,000 across platforms by documenting moments that institutional power preferred to keep quiet. She was on this flight as part of a larger investigation she'd been working for 4 months. A pattern of complaints from Creston passengers that correlated in ways the airline's customer relations team had not publicly addressed. She wasn't looking for anything specific today, but she had been doing this long enough to recognize a pattern when it started forming in front of her. She took her seat, adjusted the camera bag under the seat ahead, and waited. Then Darnell boarded. He came through the door the way he always moved. No announcement, no claim on the room. Just a man with a backpack holding a boarding pass, looking at seat numbers the way anyone looks at seat numbers. He found 2A, settled in, set the backpack under the seat, pulled out the laptop. Beverly Marsh was standing 3 feet away, helping Dr. Odom something in the overhead bin. She glanced over. 2 seconds, maybe less. In that interval, without a word spoken, something in her attention recalibrated. She finished with Dr. Odom's bag, moved toward the galley, did not stop at 2A. Jade Holloway noticed. Jade was 27 years old. 2 years with Creston. She'd grown up in Baltimore, watching her mother work 2 jobs and her grandmother work 1, and she'd been raised with a deeply held understanding that you looked people in the eye when you spoke to them, regardless of what they were wearing or where they sat. She was Beverly's second on this flight. Still learning the rhythms of first-class service, when to approach and when to give space. How to anticipate without hovering, Beverly had been teaching her. In 2 years, Jade had absorbed a great deal. Beverly knew things about the psychology of high-end travel, how to read a passenger's mood from body language before anyone had exchanged a word. But there were other things Beverly seemed to know, things that Jade had noticed and not yet named. A pattern in which passengers got warm towels without being asked, and which passengers got them only after requesting twice. Which glasses got refilled without prompting, and which sat empty a beat too long. Small, consistent. The kind of pattern that looked like nothing from far away and felt like something up close. Beverly had explanations for all of it. Inventory management, service calibration, reading passenger expectations appropriately. Jade had filed those explanations and kept watching. Today she was watching again. She carried a tray of champagne out into the cabin 20 minutes after takeoff. Walt Stover, Dr. Odom, Ann Colby, the 3 passengers in the rows behind. She moved down the aisle, making eye contact, saying good morning with the warmth Beverly called sincere professional hospitality. She reached 2A. Darnell looked up from the laptop, a document with notes in it, a cursor blinking. Good morning. Can I offer you champagne? He smiled. Brief, thank you. She poured the glass, set it on his tray. Simple, correct the job, she continued. Behind her, Beverly's voice from the galley. Quiet, Even Jade, come here a moment. She turned back, set the tray down, stepped into the galley where Beverly stood with her tablet, and an expression Jade had learned to read in progress. The gentleman in 2A, Beverly said. I'll handle his service from here. Jade kept her face neutral. Why? Beverly set the tablet down. She had a way of explaining things that sounded like shared knowledge rather than instructions. Some passengers need a different approach. The way he's settled in, he's likely an upgrade. Miles redemption, possibly. Those guests sometimes have different expectations than full-fare travelers. Better to manage that early. He ordered champagne, just fine, Jade said. Beverly smiled the way she sometimes smiled when Jade said something she considered not yet developed. That's not the point. Go check on the beverage situation in the back, Jade went, but she didn't stop thinking. The cabin reached cruising altitude. The seatbelt sign went dark. Outside, the Mojave gave way to the high desert, and the flight settled into its long eastward arc. And Beverly Marsh began the service that would end her career. She came out with the meal cart at 10:41. Started at row 3. Dr. Odom got the full presentation, the aging of the beef, the preparation, the wine pairings available. He chose the steak and looked genuinely pleased. Ann Colby selected the salmon after a brief, focused conversation about the preparation method. Walt Stover received 4 minutes of Beverly's warmest attention, a confirmation about medium rare, and an assurance that the kitchen had been briefed. She worked her way forward, toward 2A, and somewhere in that approach she made a decision. Darnell had closed the laptop. He was looking out the window. There was something settled about the way he sat. Not tense, not waiting for something to happen. Just still. The way a person is still when they are entirely comfortable inside themselves, regardless of what's happening in the room around them. Beverly stopped the cart 1 row back, adjusted something on the service tray that needed no adjustment, then moved past 2A to the galley. Darnell watched her go. Opened the laptop, typed 2 lines, meal service bypassed, no acknowledgement, no explanation offered, 10:42 a.m. Then he looked back at the window and waited. Jade was in the galley when Beverly returned. She'd been going through the beverage inventory the way Beverly had asked, keeping herself occupied, doing what she'd been told. She watched Beverly come in and begin plating the last 2 orders, and said quietly, "What about 2A?" Beverly didn't look up from the plate she was adjusting. "We're managing his expectations." Jade paused. "We have 12 steaks." 12 seats. Beverly set down the serving tongs. She looked at Jade with a patience that was not actually patience, but something harder wearing patience like a coat. Jade. The gentleman in 2A has a miles redemption booking that doesn't always entitle a passenger to the complete first-class meal experience, depending on how the fare class was processed. That's not accurate, Jade said. She was surprised by how steady her voice was when she said it. "I checked the manifest when we boarded." He paid a full fare, not miles, full fare. Beverly was quiet for 1 second, 2. Then she picked up serving tongs again. "Thank you for checking," she said. "I'll handle 2A." She came out of the galley and approached Darnell's seat with professional warmth, fully engaged, the kind that looked like warmth to everyone watching and felt to Darnell like something else entirely. "Sir, I apologize for the delay. Unfortunately, we've had higher than expected demand for the steak this morning. We still have our chicken option, which is..." "I ordered the steak," Darnell said. Quiet, not combative, just accurate. "I understand. I'm so sorry, but we've served the last of them to the other passengers." From 3 rows back, Dr. Odom looked up from his plate. From across the aisle, Deb Farrow raised her phone 6 inches and angled the camera. She did not press record yet. Darnell looked at Beverly for a moment. Not with anger, not with hurt. With the expression of a man who has seen this before, in different rooms, in different light, but always the same essential shape. "How many steak orders were there before mine?" he asked. Beverly smiled just by a degree. "I don't discuss other passengers' orders, sir. But the chicken is genuinely..." "I'll take the chicken," Darnell said, and he went back to the laptop. Beverly moved away. Her posture said she had handled the situation correctly, that this was over. It was not over. Now, the thing about Jade Holloway, she had been at the galley entrance during that exchange, had heard every word, had watched Beverly deliver an explanation she knew to be false with the fluency of someone who had delivered it many times before. She went and counted the steaks herself, walked into the galley, opened the warmer, counted. 4 pork steak entree, plated, warm, untouched. She stood there with the warmer door open and the heat rising out, and she thought about what Beverly had just said. We've served the last of them. And she looked at the 4 steaks, and she thought about the tablet. The one Beverly had left open on the counter by the beverage station when she'd stepped out. The one Jade had glanced at, not meaning to read it, just glancing. She thought about that file. She went back to the counter. Beverly was in the cabin. Jade stood there for 3 seconds. 4. Since she picked up the tablet, the screen was on. The file was still open. It was titled Service Notes, CAD Management Guide. It had the look of something revised many times. Not one document, but several, stitched together over years into something that had become dense and specific and confident in its own logic. The formatting was meticulous. Passengers or assessment, visual indicators, there was a list, organized by visual cue, clothing categories, luggage types, behavioral signals. Each category had a corresponding service designation: green, yellow, red. Green meant full service, immediate attention. Yellow meant standard minimum. Manage expectations. Red, redirect where possible. Jade scrolled. Under yellow, one of the listed indicators was casual athletic wear, dated or worn footwear, no visible luxury goods. She scrolled to the bottom. A section titled Notes on Implementation. It described how to apply the system without generating what Beverly had written as unnecessary conflict or formal complaints. How to use service language, inventory issues, fare class distinctions, passenger preference management as a professional framework for decisions that were not professional at all. Jade stood in the galley with Beverly's tablet in her hands. Her hands were steady, which surprised her because her chest was not. She set the tablet down exactly where she'd found it, took out her own phone, photographed the screen 3 times. Different angles, clear enough to read every word. She put the phone away. Then she picked up the tray with the 4 remaining steak entrees, walked out of the galley, and carried it directly into the cabin. Deb Farrow had been watching the galley entrance for 4 minutes. She'd watched the quality of Jade's stillness when she came back out. That specific way a person moves when they've seen something that rearranged something inside them. Deb recognized it. She'd been watching people process information for years. That wasn't confusion on Jade's face. That was decision. Deb pressed record. "Sir," Jade said, stopping at 2A. "I apologize for the confusion. We do have the steak available. I'd like to bring it to you now." Darnell looked up. He looked at the tray, at Jade's face, at the tray again. Something moved through his expression and was gone before it fully arrived. He nodded. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate that." Jade set the plate down, made sure the cutlery was placed correctly, asked about a drink. Water would be great. She went to get it. Beverly came out of the galley, saw the plate at 2A, stopped. Her face did what faces do when a public decision has been publicly reversed. "Jade," she said, her voice precisely controlled. "Come here." "Not now," Jade said, which was something she had never said to Beverly before. The cabin was very quiet. Dr. Odom was watching. Ann Colby had put down her legal pad. Walt Stover watched over the rim of his glass. And in seat 4B, Deb Farrow's phone caught everything. Beverly walked to the galley without another word. Jade brought Darnell his water, set it down, looked at him for just a moment. He looked back. He said, "Lee, you didn't have to do that, Luda." Jade said, "Yes, I did," and walked away. Here is what Darnell typed into the assessment file at 10:58 in the morning, cruising above the American interior at 39,000 feet. Flight 112. Seat 2A boarding to present. 77 minutes. Champagne service. Received after non-standard delays. Meal service. Initially denied. Stated reason. Inventory depletion. Stated reason factually false. Confirmed by junior crew member who independently produced meal. Pattern consistent with appearance-based service differentiation. Junior crew member, name tag Jade H., intervened against senior staff direction. Document separately. Senior flight attendant. Beverly M. service denial language consistent with trained deflection rather than improvised response. Likely systemic protocol, not individual judgment call. He typed that last sentence. Read it. Left it. Then he leaned back in the seat. The country moved slowly beneath them. Towns and roads, and the long geometry of a nation that had been built on certain assumptions about who belonged where and what was available to whom. He thought about a night in Boston. He was 24, fresh out of MIT. He'd been invited to a private investment dinner and arrived to find the door attendant looking at his discount suit and saying pleasantly that the service entrance was around back. He had stood on the sidewalk for 10 minutes, invitation in hand, watching through the windows. He had not gone around back. He had gone home and spent the rest of the night working on a business plan that would eventually become his first $100 million company. He was 43 now. He owned the plane. He thought about that. He thought about a young woman who had walked out of a galley with a tray of food she wasn't supposed to bring, because someone sitting in seat 2A deserved the meal he had paid for, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. He'd built 4 companies. He'd sat across tables from people who expected him not to be there. He'd learned to use their underestimation the way a sailor uses the wind. Let it do the work, adjust the angle, get where you're going anyway. But he had never taken for granted the cost of sitting quietly while it happened. He closed the laptop, picked up the paperback, found his page, and outside the window, somewhere over the middle of the country, the sky was enormous and blue and entirely indifferent to what any of them thought they knew about each other. He turned the page and waited for New York. Captain Lou Reeves had one rule that mattered above all the others. 30 years of flying commercial aircraft had given him a lot of rules. About weather, about fuel margins, about the specific language you used with air traffic control when something was developing that you needed more time to think about. But the rule that sat above all the others was simpler than any of those. Trust your crew, not the passengers. Not the complaint forms that got filed and processed and filed again, and eventually disappeared into a folder somewhere in Creston's customer relations department. The crew, the people who knew the cabin the way he knew the cockpit, who understood what real trouble looked like versus what inconvenience looked like, who had enough miles behind them to tell the difference between a passenger with a genuine concern and a passenger who had decided that everything happening around them was a personal insult. Beverly Marsh had 30 years. Same as him, nearly. He trusted her the way he trusted the instruments on his panel. Not blindly, but with earned confidence of a long professional relationship that had never given him a reason to doubt it. Which is why, when the interphone rang at 11:19, and Beverly's voice came through with that particular quality of controlled concern, not panic, never panic, Beverly didn't do panic. He listened without interrupting. "Captain, I need you to be aware of a situation developing with a passenger in 2A. He listened to the rest of it. Erratic. That was the word she used. Uncooperative. She said the passenger had been resistant during meal service, that his behavior was giving her reason for concern, that she felt it warranted his awareness before they got any closer to JFK. Lou sat with it for a moment. He thought about the weather report for the New York approach. Thought about the fuel situation, which was fine. Thought about the hour and 40-minute remaining in the flight. Then he said, "I'll come back once we're stable." He did not ask what erratic looked like specifically. Did not ask what evidence there was. Did not ask why a meal service disagreement constituted a safety concern rather than a customer service note. He trusted Beverly Marsh. He would spend a long time regretting that. In seat 2A, the erratic passenger was reading a biography of a man who had built something from nothing during a period of American history when people who looked like him were not expected to build anything at all. Darnell was somewhere around page 212. He had his water on the tray. The window showed a sky getting incrementally darker as they pushed east. He turned a page. He was entirely still. Jade was doing the beverage inventory the way Beverly had asked, writing numbers on the post-flight service form, going through the routine she'd been trained to go through after the meal cart came back in. It was the kind of task that occupied the hands and left the mind free to work on other things. Her mind was working. She kept coming back to the file on Beverly's tablet, the service notes document, the categories, the color codes, green, yellow, red, the clinical precision of it, the way it had been structured not as a personal opinion but as a system, something you could follow without thinking about it, something that insulated each individual decision from scrutiny by making each decision look like the application of a professional standard. She thought about how many flights Beverly had worked in 30 years. She thought about how many passengers had sat in a seat they'd paid for and been told a version of a story that wasn't true. Beverly's phone was on the counter by the coffee station. Beverly had left it there when she'd gone out to make the interphone call to the cockpit. The screen faced up. Jade wasn't looking for anything. She was writing numbers on a form, and the phone happened to be 18 inches from her hand, and the screen happened to be on. The notification was large enough to read without picking it up. The message thread was labeled JFK Ground, T3. The most recent message sent 4 minutes ago, heads up. 2A may need escort on arrival. Stand by for confirmation. Jade stopped writing. She read it again, then a third time, in case the first 2 readings had been wrong. They hadn't been. Beverly wasn't managing a difficult passenger. Beverly was building a landing. She was calling ahead, arranging for someone to be waiting at the gate, so that when Darnell Price stepped off this plane, there would be hands on his arm before he'd said a word to anyone. Before he'd had the chance to describe what had happened in the cabin over the last 3 hours. Arrive with a security escort, and you're already the problem. Already the disruption. Already the person whose account of events sounds like grievance rather than truth. Jade thought about how that worked. She thought about it very carefully, because if Beverly had done this before, and the document on the tablet strongly suggested Beverly had done many things before, many times, refined over many years, then maybe it had worked before. Maybe some other man had stepped off some other flight and found someone waiting, and had not been in a position to make it into anything. Had absorbed it, had gone home carrying something that left no visible mark. She didn't know that man's name, but she knew his morning. She picked up her own phone, photographed the screen, time-stamped visible, contact name visible, full message visible, put her phone in her uniform pocket. Then she walked directly out of the galley and to seat 4B. Deb Farrow looked up. Jade didn't speak, just held out her phone with the screenshot visible. Deb read it. Her face did something very controlled and very deliberate. The expression of a journalist who has just confirmation of something she suspected is immediately calculating what it means and what comes of next. She looked at Jade. Is this from her phone? Still on the counter, Jade said. I didn't move it. Deb looked at her for 1 more second. Then she pressed live. 220,000 people. That was the number 11 minutes after Deb started streaming. She hadn't planned to go live today, but that was the nature of the work. You didn't plan the moment. You prepared yourself to recognize it when it arrived, and then you did your job. She held the phone steady, kept her voice at the register that worked for airplane acoustics, low enough not to carry beyond 2 rows, clear enough to be understood by everyone listening through speakers or earbuds. She read the message out loud. 2A may need escort on arrival. Stand by for confirmation. Then she said that message was sent by the Liddy flight attendant on this aircraft 11 minutes ago. To ground staff at JFK about the man in seat 2A, who has not raised his voice, who has not made a threat, who simply asked for the meal he paid for and was told there wasn't any, while 4 untouched steaks were sitting in the galley warmer. She let that sit. The comments moved faster than she could read them individually, but the current of them was legible. They're setting him up. This is a setup. Call the airline. Does he know? He didn't know. Darnell was on page 219. Beverly came out of the galley at 11:43 and moved through the cabin, doing the kind of surface work that looked like service, collecting cups, checking headrest pillows, asking passengers if they needed anything, while staying 1 degree of focus away from seat 2A. Walt Stover accepted a refill. He'd been quieter in the last half hour than he'd been in the first 2. He was watching things without appearing to watch, which was something he'd learned in 30 years of real estate negotiations. You gathered more information when people didn't know you were gathering it. He was gathering a lot right now. He watched Beverly's path through the cabin. The way she moved around 2A like it was a piece of furniture she'd decided not to rearrange. The way she'd been smooth and warm with everyone else, and simply absent when it came to that 1 row. He thought about his champagne arriving in 40 seconds. He thought about his truffle butter. He thought about the man in the hoodie who had accepted a chicken meal he hadn't ordered and gone back to reading without making it into an incident. Walt turned his glass in his hand. He was beginning to understand something about himself that he didn't particularly enjoy understanding. Captain Lou Reeves came out of the cockpit at 12:09. He moved through economy with the authority of a man in a uniform who expected pathways to clear. They did. He pushed through the curtain into first class, looked around, 12 seats, various states of occupation, nothing that registered immediately as a disturbance. His eyes found 2A, a man in a hoodie, reading a book, water on the tray, everything about him contained. Lou looked at Beverly, who materialized at his shoulder. She spoke quietly, her version of events uncooperative, resistant, refusing to accept the meal situation without escalation. Signs of possible agitation that she felt warranted his awareness. Lou looked at the man again. The man turned a page. Dr. Odom cleared his throat, not subtly, not the way you cleared your throat when you wanted to be unobtrusive. The way a 64-year-old man cleared his throat when he had something to say and had decided this was the moment and wanted everyone in the row to understand that the sound was deliberate. Lou looked at him. "Captain," Dr. Odom said, "I've been sitting 6 feet from that man since we boarded. I'm a physician. Assess human behavior under pressure professionally. That man has not done one thing that constitutes a safety concern. Not one." Lou shifted his weight slightly. "With respect, sir, that wasn't a conversation starter," Dr. Odom said. "That was an observation. A clinical one. I'm telling you what I saw. You can decide what to do with it." Ann Colby looked up from her legal pad. She'd been taking notes for the past 22 minutes. Actual notes. Time-stamped. "I'd also like to go on record," she said, "that I have a detailed account of what occurred during the meal service. If it becomes relevant, I'm available to provide it in writing." Lou looked at her, looked at Dr. Odom, looked at Beverly. Beverly's face was entirely controlled. She had an answer for everything, and she delivered, each answer in the tone of someone sharing reasonable professional judgment. The meal situation was an inventory matter. The passenger's response had been, "What was his response exactly?" Walt Stover said. Everyone looked at Walt. Walt didn't look like a man who was comfortable in this moment. He had the expression of someone who has been watch a thing happen and has run out of reasons to pretend he isn't watching it. "He accepted the chicken," Walt said. "He accepted it and went back to reading." That was his entire response. He looked at Beverly. "I've been flying Creston for 12 years. I know which passengers get steaks and which passengers get explanations for why the steaks are gone. And it has always," he paused, "always been the same type of person who gets the explanation." The cabin held that for a moment. Lou Reeves stood in the aisle and felt the ground of this conversation shift under him. 3 credible witnesses. A passenger who had answered every question with his own. No evidence of anything observable. And Beverly's voice at his shoulder, very low, "Captain. We need to maintain crew authority here." He looked at her. She looked back at him. 30 years of shared professional history in that look. He made the wrong call. "Sir," he said, turning to Darnell, "I'm going to need to ask you to remain in your seat for the remainder of the flight and to avoid accessing the overhead bins or approaching the forward galley area." Not an arrest. But the next thing to one, Darnell said, "I understand." He picked up his book. He opened the laptop with his other hand, and he began to type. Here is what Darnell was thinking while the conversation happened 4 rows behind him. He'd tracked it entirely by sound. Beverly's controlled precision. Dr. Odom's clinical authority, 64 years old, 4 decades of making himself understood in rooms where being understood meant someone lived or didn't. Ann Colby's quiet, methodical specificity. Walt Stover. Walt Stover had surprised him, not because Walt had spoken up, but because of the particular honesty of what he'd said. "I know which passengers get steaks and which passengers get explanations." That wasn't an ally performing. That was a man saying something true about something he'd witnessed, and until this moment, allowed. Darnell filed that. He thought about a conference room in Chicago. He was 32. Pinnacle Group was 3 years old and still small enough that he attended every significant negotiation personally. The seller, a man in his 60s with the ease of someone who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered, had looked across the table and said pleasantly, "So you're the representative from Pinnacle?" Not the founder, the representative. Darnell had said, "I'm the founder." The man had smiled in a way that suggested he didn't quite believe it. They'd closed the deal anyway, at terms that favored Pinnacle considerably. Because Dell had done his homework and the seller hadn't done his, partly because he'd spent the first 20 minutes of the meeting deciding Darnell was something less than he was. You could spend your energy correcting people's assumptions, or you could spend your energy working. He'd learned that early. He'd made his choice early. He did not turn around. He typed, Captain Reeves, direct interaction, 12:09 p.m. Passenger restriction issued. Stated cause, crew report of safety concern. No behavioral evidence cited independently. Restriction terms, remain seated, no overhead bin esecus, no forward galley approach. Language used, not an explicit security designation, but functionally equivalent. Document separately. He read it back, kept it. Added one more line. Assess whether restriction was coordinated with ground response. Probable. Then he opened the email client. 1 bar of in-flight Wi-Fi. Enough. He addressed it to Raymond, who would forward it within 30 seconds of receiving it. And to the chair of Creston's board, whose personal contact he'd had since their third meeting during the acquisition process. 4 sentences. In transit on Flight 1112. Active documentation of crew-directed service discrimination and what appears to be a coordinated ground response. Request legal team on standby at JFK. This is handled. Do not intervene before Lansing. He sent it. Then he closed the laptop halfway and picked up the book. Page 223. Jade had been standing near the galley entrance, watching the exchange between Reeves and the cabin passengers. Watching Beverly. Watching the specific quality of Beverly's composure. How she held it even when Walt Stover said the thing that cracked the official story open. Beverly was going to win this exchange. Not because she was right. Because she was experienced, Reeves was predisposed to trust her, and the vocabulary of airline authority was built to protect people in her position. Passenger concern, crew discretion, safety protocol. These weren't neutral words. They were a structure. Beverly had spent 30 years learning how to stand inside that structure and let it do the work for her. Unless someone removed the structure, Jade went back into the galley. Beverly's phone was still on the counter, screen still on. She photographed the message thread again, more carefully this time, making sure the full timestamp was visible, making sure the contact name was clear, making sure no detail was missing that might become relevant later. This was different from the first photograph. The first time, her hands had been steady because she was in shock. The stillness of someone who has just seen something and hasn't yet processed what seeing it means. This time, her hands were steady because she had processed it. Because she had made a decision about what she was going to do, and decisions once made had a way of calming the body down. She put the phone in her pocket, walked back into the cabin, walked past the conversation still happening near row 3 without pausing. Walked directly to seat 4B. Deb Farrow looked up from the camera. Jade held out her own phone, showing the screenshot. Timestamp, contact name, full message. Deb looked at it. Her face went very still in the way faces go still when confirmation arrives, and the confirmation is worse than the suspicion. She turned the camera toward the screenshot. She read the message out loud again for her audience. This was sent, she said, 17 minutes ago. To ground staff at JFK, while the man in 2A was sitting in his seat reading a book. She paused. They are planning to have someone waiting for him when he gets off this plane. The comment section became a river, moving too fast for individual words, but the direction of it was clear. 290,000 people now, growing by the minute. Beverly heard none of this. She was back in the galley, composing herself after the Reeves exchange. She stood at the counter with her hands flat on the surface and thought about the last 3 hours. She thought about 30 years. The knowledge that 30 years gives you. How to read a cabin before the boarding door closes. How to calibrate service before the first request is made. How to use the language of the profession as a buffer between what you were doing and what anyone could formally demonstrate you were doing. She had been good at this for a very long time. The trouble was Jade. Jade was supposed to still be in the stage where she deferred. 2 years in, learning the rhythms, trusting the guidance of the person above her in the chain. Beverly had assessed her correctly when she'd brought her onto this route. Bright, conscientious, a little idealistic, which time and experience tended to wear down, but Jade had not worn down today. She'd done the opposite. Beverly looked at her phone. looked at the message thread with JFK Ground, T3, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time doing this job. She couldn't name it immediately. It arrived slowly, the way you recognize a sound you've been hearing for a while before you understand what it is. She thought about her tablet, the file she'd left open on the counter when she'd stepped out. She thought about Jade in the galley, about the small, photographically precise pause in Jade's posture when she came back out. Beverly Marsh stood in the galley at 39,000 feet and understood for the first time in this long morning that she was not the one who had been managing the situation. She never had been. She just hadn't known it yet. At 47, Darnell put the book down. He'd reached page 231. He set it in the backpack, zipped the main compartment, arranged his things with the economy of someone who had spent years moving through airports and reduced the process to its minimum. Backpack under the seat, laptop inside, the envelope in the outer pocket where he could reach it without digging. He touched the outer pocket, felt the envelope there. He'd put it in before boarding in Los Angeles for any of this. Before Beverly Marsh had did merit a glass of champagne or a plate of food or basic acknowledgement. He'd put it there because this was what he always did. Every undercover assessment, he carried documentation the way you carried a key. You didn't plan to be locked out. You prepared for the possibility. 1 hour and 40 minutes remained in the flight. He thought about what waited at JFK. He thought about Raymond forwarding the email, about the legal team being placed on standby, about the board member who had received a message from the man he'd sold his airline to, and was now doing the specific arithmetic of a person who has just understood the full scope of a situation they are in. He thought about Jade. He opened the laptop one more time, added one line at the bottom of the assessment document. Note, Jade Holloway, junior crew member, 2 years with Creston, document separately, priority. Closed it, looked out the window. New York was still an hour away. But he could feel the descent beginning in the small way you always feel it. Not in the instruments, not yet, but in the body. That almost imperceptible shift in pressure. The sense of things beginning to resolve. He was ready. The emergency session had been called at 12:55. 5 men in a glass-walled conference room near the B Concourse Operations Center at JFK. A laptop open on the table showing Deb Farrow's live stream. Phones out. The particular silence of people who are processing information faster than they can process what the information means. Gerald Hurst had been Creston's interim CEO for 11 weeks. He was 53, with the look of a man who had aged 4 years in the last 4 hours. He'd been brought in after the acquisition to hold the operational center while the transition was finalized. A steady hand, the board had called him. Someone who knew the airline's structure and could keep it stable while the new ownership took shape. He had not anticipated this. He had not anticipated any of this. Raymond's forwarded email had arrived at 12:37. Gerald had read it once. Read it again. Then looked up at the board member, sitting across from him, and said, very quietly, "Is this the same Darnell Price?" The board member had already pulled up a search. He turned his laptop around. Darnell Price, Pinnacle Group. Creston Airways acquisition finalized. 3 days ago, Gerald had sat with that for a moment. Then he'd called this meeting. Now they were watching the live stream. Watching Deb Farrow hold her camera steady while Beverly Marsh operated in the background of the frame. Watching the comment count move upward in real time. Reading the headline that 2 network affiliates had already posted online. Discrimination incident on Creston flight goes viral. Passenger did a first-class service. One of the board members said, "How many people?" Gerald looked at the viewer count. 340,000, he said. Another board member said, "And he's on the plane right now." "Yes, and he told us not to intervene." Gerald read the email again. "This is handled. Do not intervene before landing." "Yes," he said. The board member leaned back in his chair. He said, "Then we wait." Gerald Hurst looked at the live stream. At the man in seat 2A, visible in the corner of the frame, reading a book with the same stillness he'd apparently maintained for the entire flight. He thought about the 11 weeks he'd been in this job, the meetings he'd run, the decisions he'd made, the confidence he'd felt most days that he had a reasonable understanding of the situation he was in. He updated that understanding now. Then he called his assistant and said, "Get a car to the gate, B-17, flight 1112. Have the full board downstairs when it lands." He paused, and call legal. He ended the call, looked at the live stream. 360,000 now. He thought about updating his resume, decided that was probably the appropriate thing to be thinking about. Outside the window, the late afternoon sky over New York was the particular gray-blue of winter approaching from the north, the kind of sky that made the city look like it was bracing for something. It was. The descent began at 1:47, not dramatically, just that shift in engine tone that passengers feel before the instruments register it. The cabin pressure adjusting by degrees, the horizons outside tilting almost imperceptibly as the nose came down. Darnell felt it. He'd been waiting for it. He sat with his backpack in his lap, seatbelt fastened, book stowed, everything arranged with the precision someone who had spent years moving through airports and had reduced the process to its essential minimum. One bag, one pocket with one envelope inside it. He touched that pocket. The envelope had been there since Los Angeles. He'd put it in before boarding, before the champagne that wasn't poured, before the steak that supposedly ran out, before Captain Reeves had stood in the aisle and told him to stay in his seat. He carried documentation on every undercover assessment, not because he planned for it to matter, because his father had taught him that preparations was not pessimism. It was respect for the truth of how the world worked. He looked out the window, New York below, the harbor first. The particular gray-green of the water in winter light, then the outer boroughs spreading out beneath them, rooftops and roads and the long bridges connecting one piece of the city to another. Then Manhattan, the skyline that always looked from altitude, less like something built and more like something that had simply decided to exist and made everything around it accommodate that decision. He thought about what was waiting at gate B-17. Raymond had confirmed it 40 minutes ago. A brief text, 3 words. Legal team ready, which meant the email had done what it was supposed to do, which meant the board knew, which meant the machinery that Darnell had set in motion from seat 2A with 1 bar of in-flight Wi-Fi was already assembled on the other side of the door. He thought about Beverly. She had been in the galley since Captain Reeves left. Jade had told him in the quiet exchange at his seat an hour ago that Beverly was still sending messages, that the message thread with JFK Ground was still active, that Beverly was even now convinced she was managing the situation. He felt something about that. Not anger, not satisfaction at what was coming. Something more complicated. The feeling you get when you understand that the person on the other side of a confrontation has no idea what they've walked into. When you've seen the shape of the whole thing and they can only see the part they're standing in. He looked at his reflection in the window. Dark hoodie, canvas backpack, the face of a man who had been invisible on purpose and had spent the last 6 hours watching what happened when invisibility was assumed rather than chosen. He thought about Theodore, not a specific Theodore, just the man he was always thinking about when he did these assessments. The man who didn't have the envelope, who didn't have Raymond standing by with a legal team, who stepped off this flight or a flight like it in a city like this or any other, and found what Beverly had arranged waiting for him and had to absorb it and carry it home. He didn't know that man's name. He'd been thinking about him since Detroit, since the grocery store on Mack Avenue, since his father counted out exact change and thanked the cashier by name and walked out without making it into anything. Go further than they think you can go. He was about to go somewhere Beverly Marsh had never considered possible. The wheels touched down at 2:41. The aircraft rolled, slowed. The reverse thrust engaged with the sound of a decision becoming final. Outside gate B-17, the reception was not what Beverly had planned. 2 Port Authority officers stood near the jet bridge entrance with the stillness of people who have been asked to wait and are doing so professionally. A Creston ground agent with a clipboard stood beside them. She had a description, she had instructions, she was ready. Behind them, pressed against the terminal glass, 3 news crews, camera operators with Greer already on their shoulders, reporters with earpieces in, phones in hand, monitoring Deb Farrow's stream, which was now showing 480,000 concurrent viewers across platforms. They'd been standing there for 35 minutes. And in the glass-walled operations conference room visible from the bead-course walkway, Gerald Hurst and 4 board members sat with a shared expression of people who have understood, fully and finally, exactly what situation they are in. The jet bridge extended. The door opened. The Creston ground agent appeared in the cabin entrance with the standard arrival expression. Except her eyes were doing something other than standard. She was cross-referencing. She had a description, and she was looking for it. Passengers began filing out. Dr. Odom first. He paused in the doorway and looked back into the cabin, found Darnell. A direct look that said, "I am not leaving this story." And then he moved through. Ann Colby next. Legal pad under her arm, phone already to her ear, dialing before she'd cleared the door. She did not look back. She was already 3 steps ahead of the moment. Waltzed over. He moved more slowly than usual. He stopped at Beverly's position near the forward door and looked at her for a moment. Not with the ease of their earlier interactions. Not with the comfortable assumption of a man receiving preferential services. Just looked at her. Then walked through without a word. Deb Farrow, still narrating quietly. "We're deplaning now. I don't know what's on the side of that door. But I'm not stopping the camera." Then she was through. Jade came out of the galley. She stood near the forward bulkhead with her hands at her sides. Uniform straight, expression held. He looked at Darnell, and he looked at her, and something moved between them that didn't need words. The specific understanding that passes between 2 people who have spent hours on opposite sides of a situation, and both held their position without losing themselves. He nodded once. She nodded back. Then he stood up, backpack on one shoulder. The same way he'd carried it through the gate in Los Angeles 7 hours ago. The same way he'd carried it through every airport in the last 20 years. Just a man, backpack, moving toward a door. He walked the jet bridge at the pace of someone who has somewhere to be and knows how he's going to arrive when he gets there. At the end of the jet bridge, before the terminal, the 2 Port Authority officers were positioned in the way people are positioned when they've been told to be in a position. Not blocking exactly, but not blocking either. The ground agent said, "Sir, could you step to the side for a moment? Professionally neutral. Practice." Darnell said, "Of course." He stepped to the side, set the backpack down, unzipped the outer pocket, took out the envelope, white, standard business size. Creston Airways letterhead in the upper left corner because it was Creston Airways' own documentation. Their own legal team's signature on the transfer of ownership papers, their own board's authorization, their own notary's seal. He held it out to the ground agent. She took it, turned it over, opened it. Read the first line. And her face changed, not dramatically. The way faces change when incoming information is incompatible with the expectation that was set up to receive it. A small recalibration. The micro-adjustment of a person whose mental model has just been revised. She read further. The officers were watching her now instead of Darnell. Which was the moment the center of gravity in the jet bridge shifted from the man they'd been sent to intercept to the document he'd handed over. 3 pages. Creston Airways letterhead. Certified by their own legal team as part of the acquisition closing. Transfer of ownership from the previous parent company to Pinnacle Group. New owner of record, Darnell Joseph Price. The ground agent looked up. She said, "Mr. Price?" He said, "Yes." She said, "This says He said, "I know what it says." One of the officers said, "Sir, we were asked to meet this flight by a crew member who reported." "I know," Darnell said. He said it without cutting them off, just acknowledging. "This isn't your situation. You were given information that wasn't accurate. That's on the person who gave it to you, not on you." The officer processed that, said, "We'll need to verify." "Of course," Darnell said. "Take whatever time you need." He picked up his backpack, and he stood in the jet bridge with the same quality of maintained in seat 2A for the entire flight. Not performing patience, genuinely patient, because he knew exactly what was coming. Because Raymond had handled it, and the machinery was already in motion, and all he had to do was stand here and let it arrive. It took 4 minutes. 4 minutes for the verification call to connect. For someone in Creston's operations center to pull up the ownership documentation filed 3 days ago. For that person to say, in what was almost certainly an unusual sentence in the context of their normal workday, "Yes, the man you're holding in the jet bridge is the owner of this airline." Darnell had read 11 pages of his book by the time the call came back. Then the door at the end of the jet bridge opened. Gerald Hurst walked through, 53 years old, 11 weeks as interim CEO. His suit was correct. His tie was straight. But his face was doing something that no degree of professional composure could fully contain. The expression of a man who has understood the full dimensions of his situation and is now walking directly into it. Behind him, 3 board members. They moved through the door with the collective energy of people who have had 35 minutes to calculate their options and have understood that these options are limited. Gerald Hurst stopped in front of Darnell. He said, "Mr. Price," extended his hand, and then, the announcement slide without theater, he lowered his head. Not a formal bow, not a performance, just a lowering, deliberate. A specific and public acknowledgement that required him to make himself smaller than the man in front of him for a moment. In full view of the officers, the ground agent, the board members behind him, everyone in the jet bridge, Beverly Marsh had followed the last passengers out of the cabin. She'd come through the jet bridge behind them, moving with the controlled gait of someone maintaining composure under pressure. She arrived at the end of the jet bridge at the exact moment Gerald Hurst lowered his head. She saw it, and something happened to her face that 30 years of professional discipline could not prevent. Not tears. Not immediate collapse. Something slower and more total. The specific expression of a person watching the architecture of their certainty come down. Not one wall, the whole structure. 30 years of knowing who belonged where, who merited what the visual indicators meant and what conclusions followed from them with the reliability of a system that had never failed her. All of it built on a premise. And the premise was standing in front of her in a dark hoodie with a canvas backpack, receiving a lowered head from the man who ran her airline in front of 5 board members and 2 officers and a camera that had not stopped recording. She had been so sure. She had always been so sure. Darnell looked at her. He didn't look away, didn't give her the mercy of pretending he hadn't seen her standing there. He looked at her directly and let the silence hold for a moment, and then he said it. Quietly, so she could hear. "How many times did you do this before today? How many people walked off a flight carrying something they shouldn't have had to carry because of you, and there was no one in a position to do anything about it?" Beverly opened her mouth. Nothing came. He said, "I don't need you to answer that." He picked up his backpack, walked past her, through the door, into the terminal. The news cameras found him the moment he cleared the door. 3 crews. Lights up immediately. The organized momentum of journalists who have been stationary for 40 minutes and are suddenly watching their story were walked toward them. Darnell stopped. He looked at the cameras for a moment, at the reporters with their microphones already extended, at the small crowd of terminal passengers who had slowed and stopped and formed the loose attentive ring that people form instinctively when something that matters is happening nearby. He said, "I'm going to make one statement. Then I have work to do." The terminal quieted in the specific way that space is quiet when a person is about to say something real. He said, "I purchased Creston Airways 3 days ago. This morning I flew this route as a private passenger to assess the airline's service firsthand. What I found was a pattern of discrimination that no passenger should experience. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't one person having a bad day. It was a system, built carefully, maintained deliberately, protected by the language of professional authority." He paused. "I'm not standing here to describe what was done to me. I'm standing here because what was done to me has been done to other people who didn't have documentation in their pocket at the end of it. And that is what I intend to spend the next several months addressing." A reporter said, "What happens to the flight attendant?" "Beverly Marsh's employment with Creston Airways is terminated," he said. "She is facing review by federal aviation authorities for the false safety report filed during the flight. That review will proceed independently of anything I do." Another reporter said, "What about the captain?" "Captain Reeves is suspended pending an ethics committee review. He made a choice to act on a report he did not investigate. That choice has consequences." A third reporter said, "Are you planning to take legal action against your own airline?" Darnell almost smiled. "I don't need to take legal action against Creston. I own Creston. My goal isn't a lawsuit. It's a transformation. We're going to prove that an airline can address discrimination before a federal agency forces it to. Not because it's good for the brand, Because it's right. He looked past the reporters, found what he was looking for. Jade Holloway was standing near the gate entrance in her uniform. She'd come through the terminal door 2 minutes after Darnell and had stopped when she saw the cameras. She stood with her hands at her sides, still as she'd been in the galley when she made her decisions, processing the fact that she'd made them and that they had led here. Darnell said to the reporters, "That's all for now," and he walked toward her. The cameras followed for a few steps, then stopped, because this next part clearly wasn't for them. He stopped in front of Jade, said, "You still have everything?" She said, "Yes." He said, "There'll be a formal investigation. Federal investigators, probably depositions, some things that feel uncomfortable before they feel resolved. I want you to know that going in," she said. "I've been preparing for it since the galley." He looked at her, said, "I'm creating a position. Director of Crew Standards. It doesn't exist yet. I'm creating it today. It means designing the training program that replaces what was on Beverly's tablet. Setting the service standard for the entire cabin crew division. Reporting directly to operations leadership." He paused. "I want you to do it." She said, "I've been a flight attendant for 2 years." He said, "I know. And in those 2 years, you identified a systemic problem, documented it under pressure, one protected a passenger who had no other advocate on that aircraft, and made every correct call when the easier call was available." He paused again. "That's not 2 years of experience. That's 20 years of character compressed into one morning." Jade was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't hesitation. That's a person making sure they're taking something in correctly before they respond to it. She said, "I'd need to understand the full scope of the role before I commit." He said, "That's exactly the right answer." He reached into the backpack, found a card, handed it to her. Plain card, a name and a number, no title, no logo. The kind of card that doesn't need to do any work because the name on it has already done it. "Call Raymond," he said. "He'll set up the conversation." She took the card, held it, looked at it for a moment. The way you look at something you want to confirm is real before you put it away. Then she put it in her uniform pocket, right next to the phone that held the photographs, right where it belonged. Across the terminal, 2 Creston operations supervisors were walking Beverly Marsh toward an HR meeting room near the concourse management office. Beverly moved with her uniform jacket on and her silver hair still pinned. No dramatic scene, no confrontation. Just a woman walking with 2 men toward a room where her 30-year career would be formally concluded. She passed through the terminal the way she had passed through it hundreds of times before, except that the confidence that had always moved with her, the specific ease of a person who belongs to space and has never had reason to question it, was gone. In its place was something hollower, the walk of a person who has lost the story they were telling about themselves and hasn't yet found another one to replace it. She had not known she was telling a story. That was the part she would sit with for a very long time. Dr. Gerald Odom found a seat near the gate window after the cameras dispersed, coat over his arm, briefcase at his feet. He looked like a man who had decided to wait for something specific and was patient about it. His car service had texted that it would be 20 minutes late, which suited him. He wanted those 20 minutes. Darnell saw him and sat down. They didn't speak immediately. Just sat in the particular silence of 2 people who have been through something together and don't need to perform the processing of it. Then Dr. Odom said, "That was a long morning." Darnell said, "Yes, it was." Dr. Odom said, "I've taken this route 16 times in 3 years. He looked at his hands. "I've watched her do versions of what she did today. Not always with food. Sometimes with seating. Sometimes just in how long a request took to be acknowledged." He paused. "I told myself each time that it wasn't my place. That I had things to get to." Darnell said, "You spoke up today." Dr. Odom said, "You shouldn't have needed me to." They sat with that. After a moment, Darnell said, "How's the conference?" Dr. Odom looked at him, said, "That's what you want to talk about." Darnell said, "We've covered the other thing. What's the presentation on?" Dr. Odom looked out the window at the tarmac. "New approaches to minimally invasive cardiac repair," he said, "getting patients home sooner, reducing recovery." Darnell said, "That sounds important." Dr. Odom said, "It is." "Then so is this." He stood up, put on his coat, picked up the briefcase, and before he turned to go, he said, "The young woman, Jade." Darnell said, "She's going to be fine." Dr. Odom said, "I know. That wasn't a question. He adjusted the coat. I've spent 40 years watching people make choices under pressure. In operating rooms, in hallways, outside rooms, where families were waiting for news. He paused. That young woman made the right choice every time she had the option to make a different one. In conditions that would have broken most people. He said it the way he said clinical observations, not as sentiment, as diagnosis. I wanted you to know I saw it, Darnell said. I know, so did I. Dr. Odom extended his hand, held it for a moment. Good luck with the airline, he said. And then he walked away through the terminal with the purposeful ease of a man who has somewhere to be, and decades of practice being exactly where he's needed. Walt Stover was in the back of a car service heading to Midtown when he made the call. He'd been quiet for most of the drive. Watching the city move past the window, the specific flow of late afternoon New York traffic that had no patience for anything. He thought about his champagne. 40 seconds after Darcy sat down, Beverly asking about his business in New York, the truffle butter. The warmth of being treated like you had always been expected and were always welcome. He thought about the man in 2A. He hadn't done anything wrong in calling customer service. He'd spoken up in the cabin when it mattered, eventually. He'd said the true thing to Reeves. But he'd let most of the morning pass before he got there. He thought about why. Not because he was malicious. Not because he'd looked at the man in 2A and made a conscious decision that the man deserved less. He'd simply received excellent service, so assumed it was a reflection of his own worth as customer. He hadn't asked why the person across the aisle was receiving something different, because asking would have required him to consider that the difference wasn't about service quality at all. And considering that would have required him to do something. He pulled out his phone, called Creston's customer relations line. When the agent answered, Walt said, I need to file a formal witness statement for Flight 112 this morning. He paused. I want it noted that I was a beneficiary of preferential treatment during the flight, while another passenger was denied service. I'm including that in my statement. The agent paused. Sir, did you say you were a... Yes, Walt said. Write it down exactly that way. I'll be available for follow-up. He ended the call, stared at the phone, then called his assistant and moved his 4 o'clock meeting to 5. There was something he needed to think about first, about what it cost to be comfortable, about what you were agreeing to when you accepted advantages without asking where they came from. He thought about it for the rest of the drive. Ann Colby was already on the phone with her senior partner before the cab pulled away from the terminal. She'd been taking notes since 11:40 in the cabin, and she had 17 pages of a time-stamped account of everything she'd witnessed. She had dates, names, direct quotes, recalled just precisely as her memory allowed, and the specific legal instinct of a person who had spent 30 years identifying the exact moment when behavior crossed from inappropriate into actionable. That moment had been crossed several times on Flight 1112. She told her partner what she had and what she intended to do with it. He said something about the complexity of the situation given that the passenger was now the airline's owner. She said, I'm not talking about representing Darnell Price. He has his own counsel. I'm talking about the passengers Beverly Marsh applied this system to before today, the ones who didn't have documentation, the ones whose complaints went into a folder and stayed there. Her partner said something. She said some things aren't about the case that wins. They're about the record that gets made. She paused. I'll send you what I have tonight. She ended the call. Opened her legal pad to a fresh page, kept writing. Deb Farrow ended her live stream at 4:17. She'd been live for 4 hours and 46 minutes. Final viewer count across platforms, 620,000 concurrent at peak. The recorded footage had already been shared across Jager's social platform and was being referenced by network affiliates in their evening news rundowns. She sat in a coffee shop 2 terminals over with her camera bag under her chair and her 2 phones on the table and a large coffee she'd ordered and not yet touched. She looked at the footage. Not to review it for broadcast, her editor had already pulled the key segments. She looked at it because she'd been running so fast for the last 5 hours that she hadn't fully stopped to see what she had. She saw Jade walking out of the galley with the steak. She saw Beverly's face when she saw it. She saw Jade saying not now for the first time. She saw Dr. Odom stand up. Ann Colby stop writing. Walt Stover put down his glass. She saw Darnell. Across 4 hours and 46 minutes of footage, she could count the number of times his expression changed on one hand. Not because he wasn't feeling anything. Because he had learned over a long time to keep the feelings separate from the face. To let the work happen without the emotion directing it. She thought about what that cost. She thought about what it meant that he'd had to learn it at all. She opened a new document on her laptop. She had a story to write. The sofas on the 32nd floor still had the previous CEO's framed photographs on the wall. Nobody had gotten around to taking them down, which Darn had decided to leave as a reminder until the transformation was far enough along that the absence of them would mean something. The photographs were of a man shaking hands with politicians and accepting awards at industry dinners and standing on tarmacs in front of aircraft. A record of a career built on doing things the way they'd always been done. The quarterly review meeting had started at 9. Darnell sat at the head of the table with his team, operations, legal, HR, and Jade Holloway, who was 4 months into the Director of Crew Standards role and had the particular energy of someone who has been given a problem she was made to solve and has not stopped working on it since. The numbers were good. That was the first thing. Darnell let it be the first thing rather than burying it under the other things. Customer satisfaction scores up 34% overall. Complaint resolution time down by half. Employee retention rates at a 3-year high. And not a single discrimination complaint upheld by federal investigators since the new protocols launched. Not one. Paul Reardon, the HR director who had survived the restructuring by doing what Gerald Hurst had not. By reading the situation correctly and moving toward it rather than away, said, "The employee survey data is the thing I keep coming back to. People want to work somewhere that stands for something they can explain to their families." He paused. That's what the comments say, over and over. Linda Marsh, no relation to Beverly. The chief legal counsel said, "The data review closed with commendations. They're using our training framework as a reference document for the new industry guidelines they're developing." Darnell looked at Jade. "Tell me what surprised you," he said. She didn't have to think about it. "How many people didn't know they were doing it?" she said. "The Beverly version. Beverly knew. Beverly built a system and maintained it and made choices every day. But the others." She paused. 6 other versions of that document on 6 other routes. Most of those flight attendants had been following patterns they'd inherited and refined without ever sitting down to examine what the patterns actually were. When you showed them, when you walked them through what their own behavior looked like from the outside, some of them were genuinely shocked. She said, "That's the harder problem. The people who cause harm without ever having made a conscious decision to cause harm." Darnell said, "Are you reaching them?" she said. "More than I expected. The second cohort had better outcomes than the first. The third cohort better than the second." She looked at her notes. "The ones who resist are usually the ones who've been doing it longest, who've built the most professional identity around the idea that their judgment is inherently reliable. Challenging their judgment feels challenging who they are." He said, "Keep going," she said. "That's the plan." The meeting continued. Numbers and process and the specific institution in the middle of becoming something different from what it had been. It was not a clean transformation. It had friction and resistance and moments where the old culture pushed back against the new one and had to be addressed case by case. But it was real. After the meeting, after the others had filtered out, Darnell stayed at the table with his notes. The room was quiet in the mid-morning way that offices are quiet, not empty, just settled into its work. He thought about the operational review. 11 weeks, federal investigators, 46 crew interviews, document review that had produced, among other findings, 6 other versions of Beverly's system maintained by 6 other senior flight attendants across 3 routes. Not one. 6, each slightly different in its specifics, all identical in its underlying logic. Beverly hadn't invented it, she'd inherited it, refined it, codified it, more precisely than anyone before her. But the original architecture had been there when she arrived, had been there for a long time before she arrived, which meant the problem was older than Beverly Marsh, which meant the solution had to be larger than firing the Beverly Marsh. He'd understood that on the plane, had typed it into the assessment document at 39,000 feet. But understanding something in principle and seeing it confirmed by 11 weeks of investigation were different things. The confirmation had a weight to it that the principal alone didn't carry. He was still sitting with that weight when Raymond appeared in the doorway. "There's an email," Raymond said. "Came in this morning. I flagged it because of the subject line. See, he set a printed copy on the table." Darnell looked at it. The sender was Theodore Briggs, an address he didn't recognize. The subject line said, Flight 112. He looked at Raymond. Raymond said nothing, just left. Darnell picked up the page. Theodore Briggs was 67 years old. He lived in Atlanta. He had served in the Army for 22 years and retired in 2001. He had 3 children and 4 grandchildren and spent 2 mornings a week teaching adult literacy at a community center in his neighborhood. He had not flown commercially in 9 years. The email explained why. He wrote about it without drama, without making it into a story bigger than it was. Just a series of incidents across multiple flights over multiple years. No single confrontation, no clear villain. Just the accumulation of small, consistent differences in how he was treated, the slightly longer waits, the different tone, the sense that his presence was being accommodated rather than welcomed, that had added up over time to a decision. Flying cost more than it was worth. Not money. He'd stopped 9 years ago and had not missed it. Had driven when he could drive. Had skipped things that required flying. Had built his life around the decision quietly, the way you build around any limitation without making a production of it. Then his daughter had bought him a ticket to New York for his birthday. Creston Airways, first class, because she wanted to do something real for him. Something that said, I see you, and I know what you deserve, and I want you to have it. He'd almost asked her to change it. But she had been so genuinely proud of the booking, he'd gone. The emails described the flight in one paragraph. He wrote, I don't know exactly what you did or how you did it, but from the moment I boarded, something was different. The woman at the gate said my name correctly on the first try and looked at me when she said it. The man who brought my water didn't ask if I'd prefer juice instead. Nobody glanced at my coat and adjusted their expression. I sat in the seat my daughter paid for, and I was just a person on an airplane, just a person. Going somewhere. He wrote, I'm not sure I can explain to you what that meant. Maybe you already understand. He wrote, I'm going to fly again. Darnell read the email twice. He sat with it for a long time, then he printed it, folded it once. Put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He looked out the window at New York, the city moving the way it always moved. Continuous, purposeful. A place built on the accumulated decisions of people who stayed and built something rather than leaving. He thought about Jade. Building her program one session at a time, working through the friction case by case, refusing to accept that the people who caused harm without intention were beyond reach. He thought about Dr. Odom. I've watched her do versions of this 16 times. I told myself it wasn't my place. Said it without self-justification. Said it like a man who had decided to carry the truth of it. He thought about Walt Stover on the phone to customer relations, filing a statement that named himself as a beneficiary. He'd spoken up eventually. Had done more after the flight than he'd done during it. Darnell understood that. Change didn't always arrive at the right moment. Sometimes it arrived late and you had to decide what to do with the lateness of it. He thought about Ann Colby's 17 pages of notes, about Deb Farrow's footage, which had become central evidence in the DOT's new Duly review, about the 6 flight attendants on 3 other routes who had been through the new training and who, according to Jade's data, were showing measurable changes in how they moved through their cabins. He thought about Beverly. He hadn't thought about her often, not because the anger wasn't there. It was still in a place he kept separate from the work. But because Beverly was one person, and the system that had made Beverly possible was the thing that required his attention. Beverly had made her choices. She would live in the consequences of them. The system was still being rebuilt. He took the email out of his jacket pocket. Read it one more time. I sat in the seat my daughter paid for, and I was just a person on an airplane. He looked at the photographs on the wall, the previous CEO shaking hands at industry dinners, standing on tarmacs, accepting awards from organizations that were satisfied with the way things had been. He picked up his phone and called Raymond. Get someone in here to take those down, he said. Then he put the phone away. He thought about Sunday morning, 9 o'clock. Robert Price in Detroit in the house on the same street where Darnell had grown up. The weekla that had started every week for both of them since Darnell left for college and had not stopped since. He was going to read this email out loud. His father was going to listen, and then his father was going to say something, the way he always said something that you didn't fully understand till later, and then understood completely. Something about distance and direction and what it meant to go further than people believed you could go. Not with your mouth, with where you end up. Theodore Briggs was going to fly again. Jade's third cohort was outperforming the second. The photographs were coming down. Darnell Price put the folded email back in his jacket pocket, close to where his heart was, and got back to work.